first speak or speak to the topic for today, and then after they are done, we will take presentations for the mentees just within the routine that we normally follow, right? So I want to give the floor to firstly to Mr. Ayobami, right, for his presentation in today's class, and then we'll take Mr. Uboho Inyang next. Mr. Ayobami, thank you so much, sir, once again for joining. We want to give you the chance to open the floor for us. You're welcome, sir.
Thank you, Dennis. Just give me some few seconds so that I can bring up my slide. Please, can you confirm if you can see my slide?
Yes, sir, we can see your screen. Okay, your slide has gone, but we can see your screen.
Oh, okay. Okay, just a minute. Sorry, just. Sorry, working with multiple screens, so always causes a problem for me. Okay, is it up now?
Yes, sir, it's up.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so good morning, everyone. I mean, it's nice that when you might say, no, this is the legal part. I mean, or the full legal part. I mean, the concept of what we have been doing week 1 to 4 are actually equally so important because it helps you to understand what you're doing, either from the contracting or dispute resolution or regulatory compliance. So you understand how you can serve your clients or your employee or your employers better if you can understand the nitty-gritty of what the technical or engineers are trying to achieve. I had a meeting with a CEO, a group CEO some days ago, and he was saying something that the beauty about having lawyers that understand engineers or technical people is because they understand the business of energy law, business of oil and gas or power, because they can feel what those people feel and they know how to bring business solutions that work across the technical person, the business development person, the finance person, the insurance person, and even from the legal or regulatory aspects. So a good lawyer is one that can understand what the engineer is saying. You don't have to know the in-depth of it, but on the surface, you have an understanding of what they are doing and what they want to achieve, so that you can serve them better. So this week we're discussing enhancing energy contracts, so the compliance on these resolution strategies, and our agenda for today is introduction. We discussed about contracts, we discussed about compliance, and we discussed about dispute resolution also. And of course, we have our conclusion. Yeah. So, as an introduction, of course, we know that if there's any energy project or a transaction or an energy company, of course, they're going to have contracts, and it's either they're giving contracts or they are receiving contracts, and sometimes it's both. You hear a lot about oil and gas servicing complaints. You hear about a lot about oil and gas exploration complaints. You hear about Gencos, Discos, So all these are driven one way or the other by contract, regulatory compliance, and of course, to dispute resolution mechanisms also kicks in. So it's you understanding the type of contracts you experience. You are going to experience why doing this particular work as a lawyer, an energy lawyer, and which can be service contracts, it can be purchase contracts, it can be sale consumption, farming, farm out contract, different types of contracts. The list is endless. I was consulting for a company midweek, and they were telling me that, please, can you just give us templates alone? I had to come up as much as 20 templates for them. So that's how much you see different types of contracts and 20 different types of contracts, basically. Yes. So of course, regulatory compliance also, because there are laws and regulations that you have to follow. There are permits, there are approvals you have to get. At one particular time, I was working for a company and I was handling their compliance part of it. And at one time, I had over 100 licenses or approvals across several administration departments and agencies of government. So I just some are monthly, some are quarterly, some are half yearly, some are yearly, some are 5 years. So you have to find a way of having a system that works whereby you can check out the dates of expiring and also know that you have to keep a mind on this. So at first, I in my earlier career, I used a lot of Excel, but now there are a lot of EDMS platforms and tech has made it much easier. Whereby 90 days before I get a prompt and I know that I have to start renewal of this particular certification or approval or license, basically. So these are also important because if you don't have that, you can't do business, basically. You can't get contracts. Just like saying that you are in oil and gas and you don't want to have any PLC license or approval or permits. I mean, you can't do business in that without that. Yes. So of course, and if there's any dispute, how do you think you want to go about it? It's also important. Clarity is important so that there's no ambiguity at all on what you want to achieve and in dispute resolution if it arises, basically. Yes. And of course, there are various templates. You hear a lot about FIDIC. FIDIC is used widely. You hear a lot about Logic, which used to be my favorite, by the way, because it's really most common in the UK climb. So you see a lot of Logic templates there. FIDIC is a bit more universal than that. And of course, if you have to do anything that has to do with offshore energy, and you hear a lot about Binco templates being used. Yeah, also other. Most people won't use the templates hook, line, and sinker. There might be some areas you accept, some areas you don't accept. Usually, these templates are always revised every few years to bring into current modalities of rules and practices around. Like after the COVID, you saw a lot of those templates revised again to bring in something like pandemic and effect it had learning from the COVID era, so that is quite important also. Yes. So yes, you choose there are sometimes that you want to tweak it and have exceptions to the templates, and of course you have to know the templates before you can even have exceptions that you don't want in that contract. Yes. And of course, there are various government agencies and ministries, departments, and agencies of government that are saddled with regulatory compliance. Some of them are the NUPLC, that's the upstream and regulatory, and they also have the mid and downstream regulatory agency. You hear about NEC, that's a limited liability company because of the PI Energy Commission of Nigeria, and see a lot of agencies there. So talking about contract now, yes. Sorry, a minute. Yes. Talking about contracts now. There are various types of contracts. The list is endless. I mean, this is just a small part. I just give an example that over 20, so just one single complaint energy company. Yeah, so yeah, you have done doing explorations, production sharing, site procurement, installation and commissioning. ROV Contrat remote operated vehicle that goes which divers can go. So the ROV can go, much it can go. So but it's operated by from the top of a vessel or top of a rig or top of a FPSO or any platform, So they do all the pipelines, construction, and or everything construction under the water. So it's a big, and it can come as it can be between $6 to $8 million sometimes. I don't know if prices have gone up, so that's quite a big and expensive machine. Also, most likely carry those ROVs also and human person equipment and to work deep offshore. Power purchase agreements, purchase agreements, do some services, buy some parts, buy the gas turbines, the HRSG, yes, its reactors, the turbines, the transformers, generators, and you know a lot of things. Yes, then of course the gas purchase agreement, especially if it's been powered by a gas turbine. So these are some of the contracts you'd see. Then when it comes to contract, there are some terms and conditions. Usually, I usually do something I call a playbook. Yeah, and usually I do a playbook because anytime I'm consulting or working for someone and they have a legal department, I look at their contract. I try and bring the contract at par to international standards. Then I do a playbook for them. What the playbook helps to do is that it helps them to guide their negotiation. So the best point to negotiate from to the worst, the more agreeable, and the just the ones that you can just not accept. So so those classes I usually mirror them under some very important clauses so that when the lawyer is negotiating, he knows his parameters. Then when he gets to the worst he can take, that means he most likely has to go to a senior management level or maybe a general counsel or the senior shot, when it comes to signing a contract. So some of the clauses you see, sometimes you hear lawyers working, they won't tell you they're working in a legal department, they tell you they're working under a commercial department. And it's commercial because there's a whole link between contracting and also the risks and the liability when it comes to finance also. So that's why a good knowledge of finance is very, 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 very important. Yes. A good knowledge of taxation is very, very important. A good knowledge of insurance is very important. So you might this or something, but you have to have an idea because when you sometimes you have to tell them, "Are you sure you're correct?" Go and check the enabling law. I think it has been changed. So that means while you might not be the core expert, you need to know a bit about all this. The way you need to know a bit about technical to understand them. Also, you need to know about financing, talk about insurance and unlike so that you understand what they're trying to achieve. So a contract price is also always the figure that most likely your business development team or the project team would give you. But you need to factor in that, this contract price, this is X amount. For example, I'm thinking, have you looked at your profit margin? Have you looked at is in a net or a gross amount? Now, gross means that inclusive of all taxes and co, while net is the basic without it. So, if for example, I have $100 million contract, and you said, oh, your profit margin is 10%, so which you're plunging the numbers, you're okay. but you didn't take notice of during the contract, exist. If, for example, a typical oil and gas company, you're talking about holding maybe 7.5% VAT, that makes it around 12% already. Talking about maybe 1% NCD, that makes it 13.5%. That's Nigerian content development tax level, basically. We're not talking about
Mr. Ayobami, can you hear me? Hello, sir. Can you hear me? Mr. Ayobami.
basic.
Your network isn't so clear. Your voice is breaking. I thought it was maybe an issue from my end originally, but it seems your network is quite shaky, sir. Hello, Mr. Ayobami. Can you hear us, sir? Okay. Mr. Ayobami seems to be experiencing some challenge with his network. Um, we hope he's able to join back in very soon. Okay. Hello, sir. Can you hear us, sir? Hello, Mr. Ayobami.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry,
Can you
your
hear me?
network, but we can hear you clearly now.
Okay, so I don't know where I stopped. Oh God. Can you give me an idea of where I stopped so that maybe I'll be able to retrace my step? So, did you
Okay.
hear when I spoke about contract taxes and prices?
No, sir. I think I think a little bit earlier before that, you were talking about um the engineers. You were talking about engineers and how it will be easy if lawyers understand, you know.
Okay. So let me back. Okay, thank you so much. So yes, so I was talking about lawyers need to understand all aspects in a contract in the sense that you have to have that occurs in offshore or onshore contract, then also understanding that this plays a, a, a very big part in how contract is drafted. And for example, under contract prices and taxes, I was saying that your profit margin is quite important. For example, you're having a 10% profit margin, then you need to take note of the taxes because if it's a net, then there's a gross price. And if you're not taking note, look at the gross price, the problem. So now, for example, you have a term, it's a bit you need to factor in that there's a 5% for services for withholding tax, which is 5. Then there's a 7.5% for VAT, which is like 12. That's 12.5. There's a 1% for NCD, that's Nigerian content development level. That's 13.5. And maybe if it's an offshore vessel contract, then you have that 2% for cabotage vessel financing levy. So that's mixing like 14%. And your 10% is only the tax, is your profit margin. That means you're already running at a loss because you didn't factor in this into the profit margin. So it's quite important that you have an understanding of taxation, how it works, and so that you understand some companies now do a lot of free trade zone because it gives them a custom relief and also taxation relief to an extent, actually. So it's important that you can cut off some of these extra taxes off that way. And Also, it's important for featured zones, you have anything zone must start out of the featured zone. Then that means normal taxations and normal custom and really all comes creeps in back into it. So that's quite important. So and on indemnity liability and limitation of liability, yes, it's important that you know the extent in which risk you can take in a contract. There's something they call a knock for knock, meaning that whatever I give Peter, Peter gives it back to me. So that means what is good for the complaint is good for the contract, you know, and so whatever it is. But there's also what they call mutual hold harmless. For example, it's one of those terminologies on indemnity. It means that both parties will hold themselves harmless against anything. So that means if there's negligence, there's a willful misconduct, anything that results in maybe a damage to the equipment or an installation or death or injury of a personnel and everything, you hold each other mutually, not you don't hold just you don't hold you hold it is harmless basically, So that's a type of that of that. If you ensure the work you want to do, you know, there's something they call construction or risk insurance. That means in any wrong, it's really like an umbrella insurance that helps a lot. Then you have the employee liability insurance, you have the equipment insurance. When it comes to vessels, you have the all the machinery insurance for the vessel. Then against third party, you have to have a protection and indemnity insurance basically. And sometimes the coverage is as much as $500 million. Yes, that's how much insurance is important to mitigate any risk that might occur. Now, limitation of liability basically is saying about this is the this is the extent in which you can take liability you can take. Sometimes they'll peg it that any liability in this contract should not go beyond 20% of the contract price, sometimes 50% of 100% of the contract price. Yes. So it's common to know that why that way you don't have your unlimited liability. And you know that the worst case scenario, this is the cap of liability having the contract. Yes. So that way it protects especially the contractor for any excess um, liability that they cannot shoulder. So, but so also in templates like FIDIC and Logic, you see that there are exceptions to that limitation of liability. So that means they'll tell you that this contract liability is capped at 50% of the contract price, but when fraud occurs or willful misconduct occurs or gross negligence occurs or there's a breach of duty, then that will be unlimited. So you might also see that in contract. So it's good. Usually companies are always willing to always have that exclusions. They might even include defect correction, performance obligations in the contract, insurance, because even when, for example, if you insure something as if the contract price is 100 million, your insurance is 100 million. Yes. There's something the insurance man will do when a claim occurs. Something they call a deductible, meaning that they might tell you that it's 100 million, but the deductible in that contract is 5 million. That meaning that insurance company will pay you 95 million. So that 5 million naira that is hanging, who bears the responsibility? So limitation of liability helps also in pointing out that deductibles or less deductibles or more deductibles. So these are things that you factor in the contract basically. Financial securities are basically things that you want to ensure that financial wise you're covered. For example, if there's a contract that if there's a contract, for example, that you were given an advance payment of 10%, that means the person hasn't started work yet, already giving the person 10%. So we want to ensure that the person that your 10% doesn't have a problem later. So what you most likely will do is give an advance payment guarantee, meaning that you give me an advance payment guarantee, I give you the 10%. So if peradventure you don't start the work or anything, I don't have to chasing you up and you can pay insurance bonds. Yes. So I just go there and get my money back. So you also hear about performance guarantee lasts the lifetime of the contractor is and it guarantees performance. So if anything goes wrong, go and pick up with the financial institution issues it. To call a warranty guarantee also, which is during the warranty period alone. So, but sometimes you there may not be it, and you might have performance guarantee that will last to the end of the guarantee work. And also, apart from the contract, I'm so sure you pay me. You know, when I finish the work, especially when it's the first time a transaction between both companies. So, come and say, okay, fine, I'll give you a letter of credit. Credit gives confidence that whatever it is, the contractor can also the company refuse to make that payment. So that's the is that exist in contracts. So why your insurance team might be working, why your financing might be in charge of it. If a lawyer,
Hello, sir. Can you hear me? Your network is kind of bad.
okay, Dennis, just confirm you can hear me very well now. Dennis, can you hear me?
Okay, yes, I can hear you, sir. Sorry, I didn't know I was muted. I can hear you.
Okay, that's fine. So yes. So termination, like I said, there's usually two types of termination: termination for convenience and then for defect. So for defect is basically when the contractor is doing something wrong. It can also be when the company refuses to pay, also make payment. Also can also be a defect or a default, basically. Yes. So and there's also for convenience when the company thinks that, oh, for one reason or the other, it's not because of the contractor's misdeed. I just don't want to contract anymore. So and usually there are always consequences of termination for default and termination for convenience. Usually for default, most likely they'll tell you that um, depending on how you structure the contract, they tell you that the company will pay up until the last moment the contractor worked. Yes, and sometimes they'll add a clause that if peradventure the company gets a third party to finish the work, any excess amount to the original contract price, they will give the liability to the contractor that defaulted in its obligation. So you might see processes centered around that also. Yes, and usually for convenience, termination for convenience, usually you pay for the work done, and usually any reasonable, direct reasonable cost that might have occurred. For example, maybe the contractor has already ordered for some return.
Hello, sir. Sorry once again. Your network has gone bad again, sir. So sorry. It seems today is not necessarily a good day in terms of, the network. Mr. Ayobami, can you hear us, sir? Okay. Um, Sorry to the mentees. Mr. Ayobami's network is quite is is a little bit difficult for him over at his end, but we will make sure to look out for. We'll try to get him back on call. Mr. Ayobami, are you back with us, sir? Okay. Since Mr. Ayobami's network is quite challenging, I think what we will do is that we will take Mr. Obo's presentation, and then maybe a little bit later we'll get back to Mr. Ayobami. We don't want to kind of over delay on the matter of his network. So please let's take Mr. Oboho's presentation, and then when Mr. Ayobami is more settled, then we'll receive what's left of his presentation. Mr. Oboho, please, would like to hear from you.
Okay. Thank you, Dennis, and thank you, everyone. Please kindly confirm that.
Dennis, sorry.
Oh, Ayobami.
Okay. Yeah.
Hello.
Mr. Ayobami, are
Yes.
you?
Dennis, should he
Well, we were not necessarily very sure where.
continue? Why just fix my maybe when he's done and yes. So Dennis, do you want Mr. Inyang to continue so that when he's done, if I have one or two things to I'll chip in.
All right, sir. I think that would be better because it seems your network is fluctuating.
Dennis, can you hear me? Okay, yes, yes. So Mr. Inyang, please. Thank you.
All right.
All right,
Okay.
thank
Sorry for the network issues. All right. Just to carry forward or carry on from where Ayobami stopped, I would say, what else can I add with the solid foundation already laid by Ayobami? But due to the network issues, I will just continue the race from there. So Dennis, please, I don't know whether you saw okay, it's here. Yeah, so our conversation today, like Ayobami had already pointed out, how to enhance energy contract compliance and dispute resolution strategies. As our outline does separate into three distinct areas, notable contract in the energy sector, regulatory compliance strategies, and dispute resolution strategies. Ayo has already given an expansive discourse on the different types of contracts, major contracts in the energy industry, both straddling the oil and gas or petroleum sector and the power sector. Yeah, like you already said, I mean, for the oil and gas, we have contracts such as the production sharing contracts. In the PIA, these are model contracts that are to be added to accompany licenses Under, I think, Section 85 or so of the Petroleum Industry Act, it requires that any lease or license model, license granted to a lessee or licensee should be followed with a model contract. It lists out about 4 or so of those contracts, either a production sharing contract. A production sharing contract, as we all understand, I think we have already made this conversation before now, is a form of contract wherein governments brings in a contractor most often at times, an IOC international company, because I mean they have the wherewithal. But that is not to say that you cannot have other indigenous companies, but I'm just saying the usual practice. So government has an oil field, it does not have the money to fund, does not want to take the risks to spend money to explore, to prospect on that field, but there are prospects, brings in a contractor who funds, who shoulders the risk, both the financing risks, exploration, prospecting risks in this sense, being that they might end up spending millions of dollars. The risks might be that at the end of the day, they might not end up finding oil. They might find oil, but not in commercial quantity, or gas, as the case may be. But the contractor comes in, there is a concessionaire, in this case, NNPC, who holds the title to that license. And the contractor does not hold title to that field or the license. The contractor basically comes in, shoulders the risk, finances the prospecting, and when there is commercial discovery, what is done is, why it is called a production sharing contract. The share of each of the parties are made at the production level, not based on the revenue. So what is done, if let's say 1,000,000 or let's say 100 barrels of oil is produced per time, parties will sit down, they would have first deducted, let's look at it as a drum. The first partition is the profit, or the profit oil comes last. You would have taken out the tax oil, the cost oil, and all of those. Then whatever is left is now shared between the parties. Government will take a percentage from the oil, the production, not from the revenue. So you don't sell before sharing. You share from the source. The contractor takes his own part of the profit oil and goes to sell. So that's why it is called production sharing. They share the production, they don't share the revenue. Once your own part of the production is given to you, being the profit oil, you go and sell it and make your money. So that's a production sharing contract. Titles you recite or rest with the government or the concessionaire, in this case, the NNPC or NNPCL. Concession agreement. Concession agreement in this sense, more or less, let's say NNPC as the concessionaire, the license is held by the concessionaire, who is given the right to, there's how it is going to win, explore, and generally to explore oil and sell, and then pay more or less royalties and taxes to the government. Profit sharing contracts, just as you have production sharing contract. In this case, they don't share production. There is a sale of the production, and then the revenue is shared between the governments and the contractor. So sharing is done in cash, not through revenue, through production. And then you have rig service contracts. Rig service contracts, unlike a production sharing contract where the service provider or the contractor is entitled to production, as the case may be, based on the expenses the contractor would have incurred in the course of, as the capex. In the case of a rig service contract, just consider it as you bring in someone to come and work on your field. There's already a predetermined cost attached to the service. So that predetermined cost is what is paid to the service provider. And you don't engage in profit sharing or production sharing. I pay your money that you have already predetermined, which is opposite to a production sharing contract. Production sharing, it is not predetermined. You carry on with the services. Once commercial production is attained, we now look at what has been expended, and also in order for us to share the production. Farm-in, farm-out agreement. So a farm-out, for instance, if is another way of funding petroleum activities. Let's say as a licensee, you do not have money to carry on with operations on the field, you can farm out a part of that field to a third party who comes in, a part of the interest or participating interest, not just a part of the field. You can actually farm out a part of participating interest within a license or on an acreage. In that case, bringing in a third party who, let's say, you are a JOA party, you have 40% interest, let's say NNPC holds 60% interest under that JOA. You can bring in a party and farm out, let's say, 20% interest of your participating interest. In that case, the third party farms in, and the agreement there is called a farm out agreement. So in exchange for the interest in the for the interest in the joint venture, the party now pays some money and farms in. It's more or less bringing in a third party or an investor into an already formed joint venture. Okay, so we have a power purchase joint operating agreement. So when you have an unincorporated joint venture in the oil and gas industry, under the PINI, you can have there's room for an incorporated joint venture and an unincorporated joint venture. An incorporated joint venture is more or less a company. It's incorporated, so it has a mind of its own. In that case, it's not a joint operating agreement that will operate the relationship between the parties. Obviously, you have your memorandum of association and all other constitutional documents that companies do have. But when you have an unincorporated joint venture, most of the legacy operations that we have in the oil and gas sector in Nigeria, they were formed through unincorporated joint ventures. In that sense, the unincorporated joint venture does not have a personality of its own. It's still more or less a partnership. So in that case, the documents that regulates the relationship between the parties is the joint operating agreement. Let's consider it like a marriage. So it's the document that determines the husband should do this, the wife should do this, the different parties, that defines the different rules and the interests of both different parties. That's a joint operating agreement. That's for oil and gas sector. In addition to that, of course, there's the gas sale and purchase agreement. You would have heard this mentioned over and over, even when discussing power. So gas sale and purchase agreement, a lessee or a producer, a gas producer, enters into an agreement with a buyer to purchase gas produced from a field. That is defined under or using the gas sale and purchase agreement. Besides this, you have a plethora, like Ayobami mentioned, a plethora of agreements, service agreements, and all sorts of agreements but just looking at a few of these in the oil and gas sector. In addition to that, for the power sector, of course, I guess the mention of power purchase agreements, that should be still in your ears now. You've mentioned this over and over, where a generator or a supplier, as the case may be, sells power to a buyer. So that contract is called a power purchase agreement. So a buyer purchases power from a generator or from a supplier who sells in bulk. That being said, you also have connection agreements. You can have connection agreements in the power sector, connection agreements even in the oil and gas sector. Basically, connection agreements in the oil and gas industry, if you are after purchasing gas, you will need that gas to be channeled to your own facility as the buyer. So in that case, that your facility, it has to be channeled through a system, a transportation system. It has to be plugged somewhere. So whether you call it delivery points. So when the producer sells gas to you, remember that this gas is taken from the producer's facility somewhere. So when you are connecting to that producer's facility, there has to be an agreement that allows you to connect. That is a connection agreement. Or you are connecting through to a transportation agreement, a transportation facility. You have to enter into a connection agreement that allows you to connect or plug into that facility. even in the power sector. When you are connecting to use a transmission line or a distribution line to take power from a generator to your facility or to your house, for instance, if you're a bulk purchaser, you would enter into, for instance, what is called, if it is with the transmission system operator, you would enter into what is called a transmission network use of system agreement, which you are going to pay some charges in order to allow you to make use of that transmission network. Or same thing with if you are using the distribution network of a disco to wheel power from a generator or to your facility, you need to enter into the agreement to allow you, and you pay some charges, which is called the DUOS charges. For transmission, it is the TNOUS charges. So these are some of the agreements. There are a plethora of them, like we have already stated. That being said, so the next question would be, as plenteous as these agreements are, I believe one will want to ask questions around what are the typical risks, reoccurrent in agreements in the energy sector that is cutting across the oil and gas and the power sector. In the oil and gas industry, I mean, while we can all agree that there are recurrent risks that we cannot avoid that run through most of the contracts, and recurrent risks in this sense, you want to talk about supply risk, you want to talk of change of law risk, you want to talk of delivery risk, and pricing and tariff and all of those payments. I think Ayo had already highlighted some of these risks and gave some insights on how to mitigate them or the provisions to be included. I just want to take a case study of a gas supply or gas sale or purchase agreement. The typical risks you would see in such agreements or contracts, which you will likely see in most other supply agreements in the oil and gas industry. So supply risk. So, when you've entered into these agreements between the producer or the supplier and you, the buyer or the purchaser, you want to be sure that if you had contracted for, let's say, 1 million scoop of gas for the year, at the end of the year, when an annual, this is what is called reconciliation. So in such arrangements, most often at times, parties will agree to annual reconciliation. In some cases, I've seen quarterly reconciliation. In some cases, monthly reconciliation. But I think parties more or less prefer annual reconciliation. What is reconciliation? Because the gas sector, gas supply is not something that is, how do I put it? I'm looking for the term. So in order not to be caught up in constant checks here and there, what parties do, they prefer to reconcile at the end of the year or over a certain period. So reconciliation in this case is where the supplier, we cross-check the books. For the year I contracted, I requested 1 million scoff. Over the period, we also check the books. How many scoff did I receive? How many scoff did the seller deliver to me? If the seller delivered less than 1 million, what are my remedies? If the seller delivered more than 1 million scoff, what do I need to do in order to pay for the extra? Am I bound to pay the seller for the extra? If the seller, did not supply up to that amount, which is what we call shortfall. Shortfall in the sense that the seller did not supply up to what was contracted. So what are my remedies? As a buyer, you want to, as a mitigation strategy, you want to seek for liquidated damages, for instance. That could be in form of some payment for, liquidated damages to make up for the actual costs that you would have incurred in securing the outstanding or this balance for the shortfall. So it was 1 million that you demanded, but 900,000 was supplied to you, which means you might need liquidated damages to cover for the 100,000 that was not supplied to you as a liquidated damage. You can also say, instead of it being considered as a liquidated damage, in most cases, liquidated damage would be what a buyer would want to go for because the year is already over. If I want to say, okay, supply me additional gas to make up for that shortfall, which is still an option, or issue me a credit for the next year for the shortfall that you did not supply me, that could also be a remedy as a buyer where there is shortfall in supply. So there is also, apart from supply and reserve risks, which also ties into delivery risk, we can also talk about infrastructure risk. So as a supplier, you have committed to supplying 1 million scoff to a buyer, but you might need to channel that through a third party, let's say an owner of a transportation system. In that case, that transporter will now have to take up liabilities for whatever might happen between when the gas leaves your system into the transportation network. So how do you now define who takes responsibility for any shortage in the cost of transportation? You have to, in entering into arrangement with the operator of the transportation system, because it depends on how the contract is structured. In some cases, and the buyer would say, don't worry. The buyer can tell the supplier, don't worry about whatever happens. Don't worry about transportation process. I would, enter into a contract with the transportation system or the transportation network operator. Or on the other hand, the parties can say transportation should be the responsibility of the supplier, depending on which of these options. If it is the responsibility of the supplier, whoever the responsibility lies with, you want to ensure that the operator of the transportation network, takes up responsibility for any shortage, in the course of the transportation. Now, demand and offtake risk. If, for instance, now we are looking at it we had looked at the delivery risk. What then happens where, as a supplier, you have supplied you contracted 1 million scoff was contracted, 1 million scoff we contracted for that year, and you have supplied 1 million scoff, but the buyer decides not to take 1 million scoff. The buyer chooses to take 500,000 scoff. In that case, 500,000 scoff of your gas will be stranded, and you don't want to be a supplier that is caught up in that kind of situation. So how do you mitigate it? That is where you normally have take or pay provisions in such contracts, by saying that, wait a minute, as far as supplier supplies you, let's say out of 1 million, in most cases, obviously, take or pay will not be 100% of the contracted quantity. Take or pay, in some cases, I've seen 90%, I've seen 80%. I don't think I've seen 70%, but let's say between 90 and 80% of the contracted quantity, which now says, look, if I as a supplier brings 1 million scoff, and I'm ready to supply the contracted quantity, and I've sent to you, the buyer, whether you like it or leave it, whether you take it or you do not take it, you must pay me at the end of the, upon reconciliation, you must pay me at least, you must pay me 90% for 90% of what I should have supplied you as a contracted quantity, 90% of the contracted quantity. So whether you took 500,000 or you did not take at all, what is my concern is that at the end of the year, when we do reconciliation, you must pay me for 900,000, whether you took it or you did not take it. So in that case, it gives you, the supplier, that security that your gas will not be stranded, and whatever the buyer does, you are sure of getting at least 90% or 80%, depending on what the percentage was agreed, during negotiation. But obviously, as a buyer, you want to push or negotiate for lower take or pay threshold. As a buyer, you want to negotiate for higher take or pay. Buyer, you might want to push for 90%. Buyer, you might want to push for 70% or push your luck to see whether you can get less than that. But seller will want to push for as anything so close to the contract quantity, maybe 90%. If you can get, if your luck is there, you push for 95%. But so this is a way of mitigating offtake risk, price and tariff risk. So there's price for the gas that is to be supplied, the contracted price. But also remember that there might be inflation that would affect the pricing agreed. So what do you do in such situation as a supplier or even as a buyer? That is where you have your price review clause. But the price review clause in this case also, one has to be careful how it is drafted. You don't want it to appear more or less like a one-sided clause that can only be triggered by one party and is only in the interest of, most often at times, the seller would always want it to be triggered, like to be drafted to solely favor it. In that case, it will only be the seller that would trigger that review, and it will only be based on, in some cases, if one is not smart enough, it could even be that the change in the price may not need the mutual agreement of both parties. As a buyer, you have to be careful. No matter what happens, let the review also be subject to the mutual agreement of the parties. At least there should be, sort of a balance in order to protect the interest of both parties. But sometimes it is pegged to inflation, change, fluctuation in currency, what's the word? Fluctuation in the exchange rate and all of that. You can also peg it to a certain percentage. Let's say inflation, let's say 20% or 10%. So if inflation is 5%, it will not trigger the review. Anything above 5% difference, then above the current index, then it will trigger the price review. That can also help for some certainty so that price review is not triggered at every minute or every second. Then payment and credit risk. Ayobami had mentioned the need for guarantees. So as a buyer, as a supplier, you want to ensure that you get your money at the end of the day from the buyer. How do you ensure that this is protected from the get-going? You can get a parent company guarantee if, for instance, the buyer is a subsidiary of a parent company, has a parent entity. You can get a parent company guarantee, but in some cases, to a large extent, one would rather prefer, as a seller, you would rather prefer something like a bank payment guarantee to a parent company guarantee. It's not like these two security documents, they are still enforceable, but the problem is that for a parent company guarantee, there's still another leg of enforcement. It is not just automatic, unlike a bank payment guarantee that you can call on that guarantee and get your money from and enforce it directly through the bank. In the case of a parent company guarantee, you need to go to court to seek enforcement, and after that, follow that up. When the court has granted judgment, you need to follow that up to ensure enforcement. You don't really want to be caught up in such situations. So if as a seller, you are able to get a bank payment guarantee, it will be better off. Same thing with the letter of credit. Another channel one can also adopt escrow account wherein certain amounts of money are paid in advance, sort of advance payments. That could also work, but in most cases, you see bank payment guarantees being adopted, or in some cases, parent company guarantees. Like all of these things depend on your negotiation strength and how you're able to get the other party to to agree to some of your positions. For operational and quality risk, how do you how do you mitigate that? So for a buyer in a gas sale or purchase arrangement, so gas has specifications. That's the technical part of it. So when you are contracting to buy, there's a particular specification you are contracting for, the boiling range and heat range and all of those. What happens when the seller supplies off spec or below the specification agreed? How do you mitigate that? That is, I'm talking about the buyer in this case. And in some cases, um, you have a situation where the buyer would say, okay, wait, I may not reject the off-spec. I don't mind accepting it. However, your off-spec price should be lower than the contracted price. So if you had contracted $3 per scoff, off-spec gas should be lower because I'm taking lower than the spec. I'm doing you good to accept the off-spec, but lower it to, let's say, $2.5 dollars per scoff. Or yeah, you can agree on a certain percentage. You can say 80% of the contracted price. All of these things depend on your negotiation strength. Sometimes in extreme cases, the buyer might want to reject, but for commercial realities or practicalities, you have situations where off-spec would be accepted, but the price would definitely be lower than the price for the contracted quantity. Then regulatory and policy risk. So where there's a change in law, how do you mitigate that in case so that it doesn't affect the parties? You can have change in law clauses, stabilization clauses, change in law clauses to say, oh, if there's a change in law, would there be any compensatory regime to compensate any of the parties if the change in law would affect the economic situation of any of the parties? You could have that. You could, same thing, stabilization clauses, especially if this has to do with contract with the government. You have stabilization clauses that say if there's, or that the freezing the fiscal provisions, for instance, let's say government can say, look, this contract you are entering, let's say this PSC contract you are entering with this contractor, it is entered based on the fiscal provisions of this particular law, which means if a new law comes in into place in future, the fiscal provisions of that new law will not replace these fiscal provisions that were already frozen. But now under the PIA, such provision is not allowed. You cannot stabilize a fiscal provision in a PSC, for instance. So you cannot say that this contract is entered based on the current fiscal provisions, that's the tax provisions. Any new tax law will not affect the contract. No, the government, under the PIA, that is not allowed. But for non-fiscal provisions, one can enter into stabilization provisions, to say if there's any change in law, there might be compensation to this other party in order to for the party to maintain its current economic status. But you cannot do that when it comes to fiscal provisions and under the PIA. Political and sovereign risk. So same thing with regulatory risk. So let's say you want to guard against expropriation, government coming to take over a facility. This, you can take a political risk insurance with some of these multilateral agencies, which World Bank also, provide, agencies under the World Bank, the MIGA. I think there are also private bodies that also provide some of this political risk insurance to say, oh, if there is a political occurrence, let's say there's let's say in Nigeria right now, an election happens, there is chaos, and which destabilizes the system. A new government comes in, alters the whole system, seeks to expropriate. You want to take a political risk insurance to protect that investment. In case of such risk, then obviously the insurance will cover for you. In addition to that, you have force majeure risk, termination risk. Force majeure risk, I want to see if I can check an example of a force majeure clause that is just so vague. And in that case, so in drafting your force majeure clauses, you want your force majeure clauses to be as broad and as specific as possible. Because when a force majeure, so, when COVID happened, some of the legacy force majeure clauses, most of the contracts before then did not specify, did not make room for such scenarios like pandemics, like COVID. So there were lots of, write-ups and conversations around how that affected, force majeure provisions in commercial contracts then. So now you have learned to make sure that when writing your force majeure clauses, when drafting your force majeure clauses, specify as much as possible, the scenarios or that should be covered as force majeure to guard against vagueness. I want to see if there's an example of a force majeure clause that was badly drafted. Okay, something like neither party shall be liable for any failure or delay in performing its obligations under this agreement if such failure or delay is due to force majeure. Force majeure shall mean any event beyond the control of the parties, including but not limited to acts of God, strikes, shortages, or other similar causes. If force majeure occurs, the affected party shall be excused from performance until the event ends. That's quite vague. It does not specify pandemics. It does not specify turbulence. It does not specify earthquakes. Like you really want to be very specific and list out those events that would amount to force majeure, to guard against vagueness in interpretation in the future. So for instance, we had a force majeure clause in a certain GSPA. The way we coined it in a way that it was quite detailed. Let me see. So we included strikes or industrial actions, war, acts of public or foreign enemy, lightning, earthquake, act of government, change in legislation, pandemic, epidemic, outbreak of diseases. So we made it as broad as possible to cover such particular events. Termination risk. You want to ask yourself, like Ayobami has said, if it's termination, when termination happens, would there be room for any compensation of any party? Let's say termination is, in this case, is happening at the fault of one party. And what will be the provisions for compensation of the non-defaulting party? Where there are outstanding invoices, who pays what duration will it take for the outstanding invoices to be paid? What is the termination notice? If you make it 30 days or the longer, if for instance, the termination notice, if it is 30 days, it is shorter, will it be enough to make the parties to put themselves in order and, for post-termination regime? So you want to look at the termination notice, you want to look at settlement of outstanding financial commitments or liabilities. And not just that, aside from financial commitments, what other liabilities and obligations that have not been attended to, how would those outstandings be taken care of? Who would bear what and who will not bear what when the termination happens? That being said, so having discussed this typical risk in GSAs, I would believe this also run across, let's say, power purchase agreements, which as we are putting on the next slide, the typical risk in power contracts, typical like PPA, same thing, technical risk, construction risk. In that case, you want to go to mitigate it, you can go for a completion guarantee in order to, if there's a default in the construction period, then there's that guarantee or completion or an insurance to protect or to guard against defaults. Fuel risk. So if under a PPA, so there will be a fuel that will be used to run the facility. In most cases, if it's thermal, will be gas. So there's a GSPA or that is entered, a long-term supply contract that is entered. So you want to ensure that if you are the buyer, you want to be sure that there is certainty of supply of fuel. So in this case, there is as a condition precedent, you want to be sure that the seller has entered into a gas sale and purchase agreement with a gas supplier in order to ensure the sustenance or the running of the facility. Grid and dispatch risks. This is also so when it has to do with transportation or delivery, if you are the generator, you want to channel it through, let's say, a transmission line, or if you want to channel it through, if it's an embedded, channel it through a distribution line. All of this risk, who bears responsibility? At what point would the risks pass? Because you are just a supplier, you are not handling the transmission, you are not handling the distribution. So you have to define the point at which the risks will pass or the liability. Payments and credit risk, same thing we had discussed, payment guarantees, tariff and currency, price review clauses, legal, regulatory, as we have already discussed, political risk, force majeure, same thing with the termination risk. Having said that, so what are the regulatory compliance strategies? Regulatory compliance strategies, I think Ayombami had already pointed these out in summary what compliance means. So when you are operating your contract or running your facility, whether you are in the oil and gas industry or whether you are operating a gas processing facility, whether you are a producer or upstream, whether you are operating a power generating facility, whether you are transmitting a transmission line operator, whatever you are doing, you need to comply with the necessary rules, the laws, and the regulations. In that case, there are licenses, there are leases, there are permits, there are fees you need to pay per time, and most of these requirements, they are timed. So how do you ensure that you stay compliant with the applicable laws, regulations, policies, and procedures, standards, and other rules issued by governments and regulatory bodies? So before we go into the strategies, so just a refresher, we had already dealt with this, I think, a couple of weeks ago. The applicable laws, primary laws that apply in the energy sector in this case, both the power sector and the oil and gas industry. So notable laws to comply with, we have the Nigerian Constitution, of course, being the ground norm from which all other laws flow. And for the power sector, the primary law is the Electricity Act of 2023. In addition to this, you have several regulations and guidelines released time momentarily or at every time by the NERC. So as subsidiary legislations. Same thing under the oil and gas industry or the petroleum industry, you have the Petroleum Industry Act of 2021. Under this, you have different subsidiary regulations issued by the NUPRC for the upstream and the NMDPRA for the midstream and the downstream. You have the Companies and Allied Matters Act that also apply to incorporated entities that are involved in operations in this sector, and other relevant statutes, industry regulations, guidelines, policies, and directives. So what are these regulatory compliance strategies? Next slide, please. No, the next one. So what are these strategies? First things first, you can't comply with what you don't know. So if you are a compliance officer, which is what is expected of every entity, one needs to have a compliance, more or less, sometimes not even compliance officer, you have a whole compliance department that whose regular functions or regular duties would be to keep tabs with all of these requirements. So you have now the key person being the compliance officer. As a compliance officer or as a part of the compliance team, you have to understand the regulatory landscape. What does each law require of your company? What are the licenses? What are the leases? What are the applicable permits needed by your entity in carrying out its operations? So knowing this, the regulatory landscape is the first step to regulatory compliance. The regulatory bodies in the oil and gas industry, the NUPRC, you have to know them. You know the NMDPRA and the other regulatory bodies. Now, once you've understood the regulatory landscape, what is needed of you, who to go to, you now have to determine your goals. What your goals should be as a proactive compliance or as an effective compliance officer. The word compliance officer I'm using loosely because compliance is not just the duty of the compliance officer. Compliance should be the duty of the whole team. So what the goal should be primarily should be to be proactive in your approach, should not be reactive in the sense that you don't wait until NUPRC starts coming after you before you know or start sending you reminder emails or letters, or the FIRS, or as will be renamed as the Nigerian Revenue Service, that is the Federal Inland Revenue Service, will start coming after you to meet up with your tax responsibilities. You don't wait until they start sending you reminders. Proactive in the sense that you ensure that if, for instance, you are to make returns, let's say tax returns, for instance, within 90 days, I'm just setting an example, you don't wait until it's the 90th day before you start running helter-skelter, or you miss a day and then you go pay the penalties. Try as much as possible to, why not even make the returns within 30 days? Make it, the earlier the better. So the goal should be proactiveness. Yeah. Then having done set your goals, general goal, like you said, should be proactiveness. But in addition to that, you would have now had other specific goals, listed under that umbrella goal of being proactive. Train employees. Like we said, compliance is not a one-man thing. It's not just the function of the compliance officer or manager, as the case may be, or director, whatever acronym and whatever designation is given. It should be everyone's duty. It should be ingrained into the DNA of the organization. So the need for training of employees is very important, and it should not just be a one-off thing. It should be a regular thing, because if you provide training this month, for instance, a new law may come up the next 3 months. And if you're not making the training a regular and recurrent thing, which means some of the employees may be ignorant of what is needed of them, based on the new law. So it has to be regular, and it has to be structured in a way that it meets, changes happening within the landscape, just to keep them current and updated on changes in the system or in the industry. Implement robust compliance policies and share compliance responsibility across teams. Like Ayobami has said, I think he mentioned something about tracking. At first, he was using Excel sheets, and then now he uses the different EDMS platforms available. So, okay, this is monitoring. Okay, so robust compliance policies. So every entity, you need to have a compliance policy. Compliance policy is about around things such as acceptance of from let's say, third parties. As an IOC, for instance, there will be policies around acceptance of gifts from suppliers who or service providers who provide services to the company, because you don't want a situation where your staff or your employees are induced by third parties in order for them to get contracts. Some goodwill in quotes gift may actually be, a decoy to gain favors. So there should be compliance policies related to such, areas. Compliance policies, for instance, regarding if you are engaged in manufacturing, the raw materials, how they are sourced, compliance policies around human rights violations. Some of these international companies, they have compliance policies around the sourcing of raw materials. For instance, if you are sourcing raw material, let's say you are engaged in the EV industry and electric vehicles, you are producing batteries, you want to provide compliance policies relating to how the raw materials are sourced from, let's say, a place like Congo. Are human rights violations involved in the sourcing of such materials? If they are, then obviously your compliance policy should be against such, which means that you should not purchase raw materials from such sources. Compliance policies around harassment, compliance policies. So these compliance policies should be broad, covering every aspect, the operational aspects, employment aspects, of general aspect of the entity, and who is responsible for what. There should be that what was the not delegation of functions. Um, yeah, more or less, okay, delegation of functions, not really. Um, what's the word? Each team member should be clear as to what he or she is doing in terms of compliance, share responsibilities across board. It should not just be a one-man thing. Develop a monitoring framework and monitor compliance. Like Ayobami has said earlier, he was using Excel sheet, but now he has progressed to using EDMS platforms. Um, so inculcate a smart monitoring system. A manual monitoring system, you might miss the specifics. We recently, some months ago, in my previous employment, we did a compliance grid for an entity. We made in a way that in a smart way, in a way that you just need more or less. So there's a trigger. When the period it's nearing or the deadline, so you have advanced notification for each of the responsibilities, I would say, that needs to be made at each time. So you make it in a very smart way that you can follow through and monitor compliance. Risk assessment and mitigation. Risk assessment and mitigation is a very important core part of compliance. You want to sit down and assess the risk of each um, of each responsibility, of each obligation of not meeting up, so that you allocate priority per obligation, and also look at it from, if there is a particular scenario, what is the worst case, and how do you mitigate where such situations arise. And in this case, you have to be proactive. So let's say a new law is about to come in, and you know that with this new law, let's say, for instance, when the PIA was to be enacted, some companies who were proactive, they ensured that even before the PIA became effective, they had already reached out even to law firms, first to seek interpretation of how the new provisions will affect their services. Second, to know how to navigate that turning part. This is an example of, assessing risk being proactive. You don't wait until the new law has caught up with you before you now go into assessing the risks involved in the changes, before you now go into assessing how to mitigate those risks. Adopt new technology and adapt to regulations. Adaptation. It's easier to adapt when you are proactive. I just cited the example of the PIA and companies who were proactive even before the PIA came into existence. They were able to transition smoothly, into and adapt with the new law. Adopt new technology. We have just mentioned smart monitoring systems, EDMS platforms, which you can use in monitoring. Gone are those days where one would have to rely on manual monitoring systems. Those are stale now. So adopt technology where needed. And that will help a lot. AIs, in these days, AIs can help you in even tracking some obligations or helping you to keep tabs with changes in the system. Prepare for audit. After all of these things, we know that the regulatory bodies sometimes, as it is mandated of them, it's part of your functions to also ensuring compliance. They can come for audits even without invitation in certain cases. So you don't wait until they knock at your door before you put your books together, which means you should always be ready, as part of compliance functions. Always stay ready, never be caught off guard. Because let's say, for instance, the FIRS, the taxman can knock at your door to check through your tax compliance books. So having said that, dispute resolution, just to have a run through so we can, okay. Dispute resolution strategies. There are different dispute resolution techniques or strategies. You have expert determination, you have negotiation, you have mediation, arbitration, litigation, and the list goes on and on. Expert determination, a scenario where if there's a dispute, let's say in a gas sale and purchase agreement, there's a dispute as to quantity or dispute as to spec of the gas. In such thing, it's a technical issue. So in most cases, you subject that to the determination of an expert. Because if you take that before the courts, one, wastage of time. Two, courts do not have such expertise. So things that are technical like that, for the most part, you subject that to experts to determine, who have knowledge of this industry. So parties will just subject a dispute to an expert who would decide for them accordingly based on his or her expert's knowledge. You have negotiation. Negotiation involving the parties in the contract where there's a dispute. They sit down to negotiate more or less. You don't have a third party involved. In most dispute resolution clauses, you have situations where, I wouldn't want to say most, but I've seen more dispute resolution clauses for instance, in the oil and gas sector. You have more of a segmented dispute resolution process. You start first with negotiation, amicable settlement. If amicable settlement fails, you can now progress to arbitration. In most cases, arbitration would be the last resort. In some cases, maybe progress to court, but you see more of arbitration because arbitration is more commerce friendly, especially for the sector which we operate in. You want to go for a dispute resolution mechanism that does not end up wasting so much time, and parties are reasonably a bit involved in the process. They have a say of the process, and it also saves time. So you have mediation. So negotiation, settlement between the parties, or discussion more or less between the parties. Mediation, you have a third party. But mediation in this case is not binding by itself. An agreement reached during mediation, a third party who facilitates, unless you now reduce it to a consent. No, how did they call it? So you can now take it before a court, and it will now be pronounced as a consent judgment by parties. And in that case, you need to apply, like institute an action, and then bring the settlement agreement before a court, and the court will pronounce on it as a consent judgment, on which ground it will become binding or enforceable. But generally, mediation agreements reached during mediation are not enforceable. Like, they don't have the binding effect as you have an award during arbitration. Then you have arbitration. Arbitration, there's a third party facilitator, could be one, could be two, depending. It could be ad hoc, it could be institutional. Ad hoc in this case, so institutional is an arbitration process where you have it under the supervision of different of an institution, like, let's say, the Chartered Institute of Arbitration in Nigeria. You have for the international, I think you have the London Court of International Arbitration, LCIA. Is it the London? Sorry, I lost. Can you still hear me, please?
Yes, sir, we can hear you now, but you were going for a minute. I thought it was from my side.
Okay, it's from my side. Okay, just to wrap it up. So please, the next slide, just to look at the differences between these different strategies. Expert determination, a private process involving independent technical expert, like I already explained. The attributes, binding decision made on technical rather than legal issues. Generally cheaper, less procedural than litigation and arbitration. Like I said, experts are involved in this form, and it's confidential. For negotiation, like I said, often the first step allows parties to communicate amongst themselves. No neutral arbiter. It's confidential and private, but also non-binding. Same thing with mediation, non-binding, confidential and private. Seeks to preserve relationship if it's time saving and cheaper, less formal than litigation and arbitration. For arbitration, it's quasi-judicial. So it has the semblance of a judicial process, though not fully a judicial process. So there's a neutral arbitrator or arbiter who listens to both sides, makes a binding decision, what we call award, more formal than others, but generally quicker and cheaper and more commerce friendly, especially because it saves time. The question whether it's cheaper can be debatable, because in some cases arbitration can be costly. You know, then each party may be represented by counsel. Then there is a law, the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, which regulates these operations. I want to be sure that I got that right. I think it's arbitration. It's actually not Arbitration and Conciliation. I think it's Arbitration and Mediation Acts. Sorry, my apologies. Please, you can correct that. It's arbitration.
Yes, Arbitration and Mediation Act.
Yes, of 2023. For litigation, obviously, that is court process. It can be time wasting. It may not save costs as compared to others. I don't know about arbitration. That's still debatable. I wouldn't want to say it's not as commercial friendly as the other mechanisms. You present dispute before a judge or jury if you are in the US. Generally, it's time consuming, especially if it is Nigeria. Binding process, that's the major difference in the sense that the judgment of the court is binding and enforceable. And it's often a last resort where others fail. But that doesn't mean that in all the contracts you see litigation. Like I said, in most cases, you see first amicable settlement and thereafter final resort to arbitration, and that is final. But okay, so basically that's a rundown of what I've had to say, and thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Yang, for your thoughts shared in class today. It was quite extensive and I would say also very detailed. Before we go back to Mr. Ayobami, I'm sorry, sir, we still have you in mind. So what would happen is that we take Menti's presentation, and Mr. Ayobami, during your feedback, we would also want you to wrap up with some of the things you wanted to say that you did not get to say. All right. So for the mentees, let's quickly take presentations, 10 minutes post for each team, and let's see if we can take feedback and still try and end in good time. All right. So please, if we have the presenter in class, the presenters in class, group one, please, you can go ahead and start your presentation. Do we have the presenter for group one in class?
Yes, we do. Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, good morning. We can hear you.
Thank God I made it here. I had a lot of technical hitches. Okay, I would love to share my screen now. Right,
Yes, please. And please, let's try and be as fast as possible, right? So that we
right,
can
sir.
finish in good time.
Sir. All right. Just share sound. So, just hold on. Can you see my screen now? Hello?
It's coming up. It's almost the signaling that is okay. Yeah, it's up now.
It's up now, right? Okay. Just hold on. Let me go through the. Come on. All right. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, mentors, mentees, and coordinators. My name is Paul Dike Chidebube Ebubechi. I'm presenting in behalf of Group 1, Energy Industry. Okay, we are to be talking about enhancing energy contracts, compliance, and dispute resolution strategies. Before we continue, let's talk about what energy contract is. Energy contract is simply an agreement between parties involving the production, sale, or purchase of energy, like electricity or gas. Example of this energy contract, just like mentor stated earlier, is the PPA, power purchase agreement. That is what energy contract is. There are so much examples as well, but for sake of time, let's move to the next slide. Okay, now the key components of an energy contract. Here you have the parties. We have the parties. We have, of course, the parties must be clearly spelled out. The oil company, the government agencies, or the service provider, they must all be clearly spelled out. And then, sorry, I have an incoming call disrupting. All right, sorry for that disruption. Then you also have the obligations. The obligations of the parties must be clearly spelled out in such a way that there will be no ambiguities, the terms, the remedies, penalty, the governing law, the jurisdiction. Of course, okay, just taking me to the next slide. Sorry for that. Then the regulatory compliance let me take this off my screen. The regulatory compliance in energy contracts. Before we talk about regulatory compliance, am I still hard? Am I still being hard? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay,
yes, we can hear you.
Oh, thank you. Before we talk about the regulatory compliance in energy contract, it is expedient that will know the regulatory bodies and then the different laws from which these bodies emanate. Now, of course, the regulatory bodies, we have the NUPROC for upstream, it has to do with the upstream sector of the oil production company. I think the act that from where it emanates is the PIA, that is the Petroleum Industry Act. We also have that of the midstream. The midstream, I think skipping my memory, the name as it's pronounced. We also have the NEC for NERCC, think Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission for the electricity sector. Okay, we also have just hold on. I have to consult my material to be able to get this for sake of time. I'm trying to rush. Okay. Okay, are you still with me? Hello?
Yes, we are still with
Now
you.
for the neck, the acts from where it emanates is the Electric Power Sector Reform Act of 2025. Yes. Then that midstream I was talking about is the Nigerian Midstream and Downstream Petroleum Regulatory Authority. It also emanates from the PIA as well. You know, they regulate the midstream and downstream oil and gas activities. We also have, okay, I've mentioned the NEC. Then we have the Federal Ministry of Environment, responsible for ensuring energy projects, you know, to comply with environmental regulations. We also have the Nigerian Content Development and Monitoring Board, which promotes local content and ensures increased participation of Nigerian companies in oil and gas contracts, and so on and so forth. Then their key roles is to ensure, what's it called? For instance, in electricity, tariff settings and pricing. They will have the licensing and permits. We also have environmental and social governance, local content development, renewable energy promotions, and so on and so forth. So that is each of these laws. This thing is moving faster than I want it to. Okay. Each of these laws stipulates the various rules and things that should be done as a matter of compliance. So it is expedient that the entities going into the energy contracts are very much acquainted to these laws and the various bodies that these laws also created and their various functions, so they don't fall short of the laws stated in those the provisions of the law. All right, dispute resolution in energy contract. The mentor has also done justice to this, so I'll not be repeating what he has said. There are several mechanisms developed to resolve issues, and of course, it also has to be the dispute resolution. There is a particular in the contract. There's a particular what's it called? Boilers what's the terminology for it? It's also contained in the contract dispute resolution that states the body or the mechanism that will be used to resolve any issues that emanate as a result of the contract. It can be either through mediation, negotiation, arbitration, or litigation, depending on what is being agreed and content in the energy contract. The challenges in implementation, we also have financial and infrastructural constraints. You know, energy contracts are such that it's very, very capital intensive. So financial and infrastructure constraint can be one of the challenges. We have corruption and political interference, policy inconsistency, lack of tech, moving much faster than a shadow. Okay. Now the next one is strategy for stronger energy contract. Now, while you're understanding the role of contract as risk management, now, like I stated earlier, that energy contract is capital intensive, and there are a lot of risk involved. There are a lot of risk inherent in the energy project, and then, you know, such as market volatility, capital intensity, regulatory uncertainty, and the rest of them. So you have to ensure there is an effective contract risk allocation in such a way that it is fairly, distributed between parties. I have an instance here, for instance, in contract, in contracts involving Nigerian petroleum contracts, the upstream risk, like exploration, failure, are borne by the operator, while financial risk are shared with the state through production sharing contracts. Now, you see, by this way, you see the risk is balanced. But if you're not aware of these things and it is tilted only to one side, such contracts may not really, there's bound to be disputes in that contract. There's bound to be dispute in that contract. Then drafting with clarity and foresight. Of course, you have to envisage certain things that are likely to happen, things that are likely to raise up as an issue, and then make sure that it's encapsulated in the terms of the contract. And then so that when it comes up, there will be no much dispute because it's already provided for in the contract. Adapting to market conditions, just like I said, because of the risk involved, you must make sure that the terms therein is such that favors you should those risks arise, like the force majeure. In this one, exempt parties from a risk that arose as a result of no fault of theirs, into natural circumstances and the rest of them. Then change in price, change in law, price in opener clause, and the rest of them. All these are intended to mitigate risk and make it in such a way that it is stronger and devoid of conflicts. Because you have to incorporating compliance and ECG standards. Of course, this is what it calls mitigation, adaptation, and accountability. Then, in conclusion, having known that the energy contracts are very capital intensive, it is expedient that while drafting such contracts, you make sure it is well drafted. The regulatory compliances, you are very much acquainted with the laws and the regulatory bodies. And then there is an effective dispute resolution mechanisms chosen. Of course, you have to look at the one that will favor you. Is it litigation? Is it arbitration, mediation? Okay, so it must be enshrined in the contract. And of course, our future outlook, we are looking at digitization of contract such a way that it becomes smart, what is smart contract, and then sort of compliance tracking technologies so that as to reduce human errors and corruption, while the shift towards green energy demands contracts are prioritized in environmental obligations and international harmonization. So with this, I think to come to the end of my presentation, our presentation, group one. Thank you for listening. Hello? Is anyone still there? Can anyone hear me? Hello?
Hello. Okay, so sorry.
Hello?
I think Dennis, most likely got cut off. Yes, he's not online. So I don't know. Is there another group for presentation?
Yes, there's another group for presentation, group two.
Okay, so maybe group two can start so that maybe we'll not take comments from the mentors afterwards, and we can do it that way. So group two, please. Thank you. Is there anyone in group two?
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, sir. Can you hear me, sir?
Okay, I can hear you. Please go ahead, please.
So, unfortunately, sir, we will not be able to present today. Our presenter is not still not ready as well.
Sorry, the presenter is not what?
Like our presenter is not ready. He's not here. Sorry.
And nobody else in that group can take the presentation.
Correctly, sir. No, sir.
Okay, is there any presentation at all? That's the first question I think I should ask.
Yes, there is a presentation.
Then someone should be able to take. I mean, usually, I don't know if Dennis told you, usually there's always a main presenter and a backup presenter. So that if for any reason, like network problem or the other, another person can always step up in the group to take the presentation. Yes.
Yes, yes, sir. Usually we do have that, but Mr. William will be aware of some of the challenges we are facing in our group. Group two, we are short on personnel currently because a lot of people that started the program with us, they
Okay.
did not continue.
Okay, so I guess Dennis would have to discuss with you on that then. Okay. Sorry, Mr. Ayan, I don't know, do you have any comments on the first presentation before I take mine, and also a bit of a continuation of my last presentation?
Okay. Yeah, don't worry. You can just proceed so that you can have some time for yours.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I've shared my presentation since I couldn't. Apologies, my network was just been very bad today. So I shared it with on the chat section. So in case you want to have a second look at it, you can do that at your leisure hours. Yes. So Mr. Yang has spoken. I mean, he has covered most of my slides. I just wanted to chip in a few points. But even before I even go that, on the first presentation, I don't know. I feel that I didn't feel the presentation. I mean, the slides had very interesting details, but I didn't feel it in the presenter's presentation. You know, I mean, the slide is supposed to be richer than what he presented, and I don't know if it was my network or I just felt there was a disconnect in between the presentation and the slide. Then I laughed a couple of times because there was a particular slide that you said that the mentors have discussed and decided to skip it. But I felt like the whole idea of presentation is for you to talk about it. Even if we have presented things in class, I mean, the whole idea is to show how much research was done on your end. And if you have to discuss it, you still discuss it, because honestly, I know Mr. Anyang will tell you that we didn't have enough time. We were trying to be fast as much as possible because of our time. Because, for example, let me give you a good example. I do my contract draft has been used like 3 companies in Nigeria. One is in multinational, 2 other EPC companies, 1 in Canada, and I think 1 in the UK. And usually when they have a new lawyer in, I usually have an induction section for them. And believe me, it takes about 5 to 6 weeks. Yes, I mean, it's like 5 to 6 weeks, but last 5 to 6 times. That means maybe once or twice a week, basically. Yes, because that's how in depth it is for lawyers that are already experienced, by the way. So us cramping it into one class, you notice that we were quite fast in talking because there are a whole lot more than that. So, yes. So hopefully maybe JIIPCC subsequent classes will give us more time for especially the contracting part of it. Yes. So yes, like I said, more work should be done, and at least, but yours is actually still better than group 2 that had no presentation and no nothing to say basically, and that's disheartening because the mentors and the program organizers are putting so much effort, and that a particular group cannot meet to just present something. So it's disheartening to, I mean, at least I can talk about myself. I know most like Mr. Yang will say the same, that, I mean, we expected more from group 2. And so please, I mean, when you're involved in something, let's take it serious, because no matter what we say to you, it's when you can relate it to your research, then you can remember vividly and you can use it in the nearest future. So please, let's take things like that more serious. And if you're involved in any program, try and do some groundwork, try and do some research. Yes. And that will help you. And that is those things that will stay with you, not really what we're telling you. What we're telling you stays with you faster when you have an understanding, no matter how basic it is. So please, let's put in more efforts in that. So just a few things I want to chip in. I won't be able to share my slides so that my bandwidth won't get affected. I just wanted to point out the governing law clause. Now, this crisscross is for resolution and also contracting. I see a lot of Nigerian lawyers try to bring in the foreign jurisdiction into transactions without having a proper grasp of that foreign jurisdiction or couching it well enough. And this is something that most of in-house counsel, general counsels, have had this discussion in the past, that our dispositional clauses, most people don't think about an issue will go wrong, but it might go wrong. So there's clarity. I think Mr. Yang spoke about it a lot. The most clarity is required in that dispositional clause. One, the laws you must have. For example, let me be clear. The NCDA during their audit must frown against you having a foreign law firm working for you, and most likely a foreign jurisdiction. They're always trying to pick it up in audits. So that's especially when the transaction is being done in Nigeria. But when, for example, it's a transaction between a Nigerian entity and a foreign entity, most likely you have to use a foreign entity, because the foreign entity will tell you that, you're not so conversant with Nigerian laws, and they have their misgivings about Nigerian law. So they most likely would push for a foreign entity to a foreign jurisdiction for that transaction. And I'm a bit biased to the English law because I've worked in England and law firm and companies in England, and so I'm a bit biased to that. But they'll tell you that something like a Singapore, when it comes to arbitration, like the SIAC in Singapore International Arbitration, that's one of the fastest growing arbitration centers in the world. So you might see a lot of foreign transactions, especially when it's involved Asian complaints, and go to SIAC instead of a London Court of International Arbitration, for example. So, but most of the foreign will tell you that it's arbitration either LCA or SIAC, and those are most of the two popular ones I see around really. And so you agreeing to it also means that you have to understand their process. It's easier to just say, oh, when we get to that bridge, we'd figure it out. No. For example, now, if you're having a transaction with another company outside Nigeria, and they're talking about for example, let's just use English law, for example. There's something they call the UK Unfair Contract Act. I think it's modified into the Consumer Act now, and meaning that there's some things you will agree in the agreement that the law says that it's not valid. For example, now, your agreement limits, your indemnity clause limits negligence for consumer goods products. The UK Act is specifically that you can't limit your liability for that. So if you now chose in English law, you don't know what the English law is saying about it. So these are things. So there are things that familiar. For example, the all force majeure. It's more of once you agree in contract, it's fine. If you don't agree in contract, then the doctrine of frustration in England, English law, comes into place. So if you don't know about the English law, sometimes it's safe for you to stick to the law you know about, or do a further research, or else you think that you're agreeing to something and try agreeing to something else in the law. Yes, but as much as possible, for good contracting practices, even the English law tries not to impose, except there's a lacuna. But there are some laws that even if you agree on, the law still has to take an effect, and most of them are under that unfair contract principles, basically of the English laws. So it's quite important that you have a strong grasp of the law you are signing in for. Yes, and also there's always a dispute that I talk about every time. And when I'm negotiating contracts in either Germany or Italy or England or Asia, there's always a bit of a eye opener for lawyers, because there's this difference between the laws of the United Kingdom, the laws of England and Wales, the laws of Great Britain, no matter how it's couched. Yes. And I already said that it actually gives an indirect room for forum shopping. The laws of the UK means there are multiple countries you can go to. The jurisdiction is endless. And you don't want to have a parallel disposition mechanisms being kicked at the same time. So it's quite important that you have a specified area. The law must be specified. The disposition mechanism must be specified. Where it's going to be done is to be specified. The rules that must be used should be specified. The mode of appointing arbitrators should be specified. It must be strictly specified. Even the language, especially when you're having a counterparty that's not an English-speaking counterparty, the language is very important. These are things that must be clear in this resolution clause, And yes, England and Wales is the decision of England and Wales is a nomenclature in the sense that even the laws are said, the courts are said in the courts of England and Wales, but the Welsh also have their own parliament. So meaning that the Welsh law can be also different from the English law. But right now, usually in contracting, the English law has more provisions than the Welsh law, but the parliament are still turning out legislations, and sometime in the nearest future, you might have a bit of a clash between what the English law and what the Welsh law says. But wherever there's a lacuna in the Welsh law, the English law comes over to fill in that lacuna. But there are still different parliaments making laws there. So once you're writing law of England and Wales, just know that you are submitting yourself to likelihood of two different legislative elements of English and Wales, even though they have the same common court system. So it's quite important, yes. But for now, it's safe. But the more the Welsh law proposed, because right now the Welsh law parliament is only on social, they're bringing out social legislations and the like, not really affecting the contract terrain per se. But it's good to have a clear discussion, especially when it comes to a long-term contract. So these are things I just feel that we should act. And also when you're having a distribution, even if a distribution clause, even if it's for dispute resolution, even if it's for arbitration or ADR or any forms of ADR, it's important to sometimes leave a room for the courts, especially when it comes to injunctive reliefs. Because sometimes you want, before you go to arbitrator, and that thing might still be continuing. So you want to stop it, put an injunction and stop it so that you can now settle. So for injunction in law, you can just give that right to go to a court for reliefs, just injunctive reliefs, while the main suit is still being held, or matter is still being held under arbitration. And of course, Mr. Yang spoke about enforcement also. So these are things I feel I should just point out there, and so that it will help us to prepare for this resolution that might and might not happen. So I hope that helps. So I don't know if Dennis is back. Mr. Yang, do you have anything to put in, to just say also before we go to question and answer? To make it
okay.
So sorry.
Oh, Dennis.
Okay, Mr. Yang.
Yeah.
No problem. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, all right. Oh, so sorry about my presence. I was locked out and I didn't notice on time, so I had to work on getting back into the call. So sorry. Thank you, Mr. Ayobami, for taking over while I was temporarily away. Okay, Mr. Iang, since you wanted to say or add something, I'll just leave you to do that and then we'll take questions.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Ayobami. Great addition as always and insights. Actually, that's a differentiation that you always make about the law of England and Wales, laws of UK. It's actually very interesting because even here in Nigeria, one might not pick that difference if one is not in a session like this. I'm grateful. For the presentation, I also align, to be honest, I think, well, first things first, well done for turning up, but I also feel like Ayobami said, perhaps you should have given it a little bit more effort. In fact, at some point where I think you were just sounding a bit, there was just this in quotes, I don't care, let's just do it and just move on. I don't know whether you felt maybe you're not ready or something, but I want to believe that you also sensed that when you were presenting. So maybe next time you put in more efforts when you are doing stuff like this, Well done. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Iang. So we apologize for the presentation so far. I think Group 2 had a little issues from their end, and I was in touch with the group leader this morning, so I thought they would be able to still come up with their presentation to present in class. So our sincere apologies for that. We'll do well to address it. Um, so just before we go, please, if you have questions for our mentors, let's take questions. We can take maybe 2 or 3 questions. So if there are any persons within the call that have questions that they would like to ask, let's quickly do that. Mind you, right, for the mentees, this is going to be the last class, right, for the energy industry. So after this, you may not necessarily get the opportunity to meet the mentors in class like this, right? So please, let's do well to ask questions overall, as in regards to the energy industry. I think even from different aspects, even different aspects, whether if it is be on whether if it be on power, fossil fuel, renewables, and even crisis, right? You can still generate questions from there. So please, can we take 1 or 2 questions from the mentees? Please, if you have a question, you can do well by raise of hand, or you know, raise of hand, or you can send your questions into the chat box. Okay, Mr. Marvelous, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to the mentors and Mr. Williams. Thank you very much. I don't know if you can hear me very well. Hello?
Yes, yeah,
Can
please go ahead.
you? Okay, first and foremost, I really want to thank our mentors, Mr. Ayobami, and all our mentors, especially. I really want to thank them. The session, I didn't even realize that today is going to be the last time we'll be in class. I was expecting that we are going to have at least one more class before the mentorship is over. So it's quite impromptu to me. So the question that I have right now is not really related to what we did in class today because I absolutely understood everything that was said in class today. So all thanks to the mentors for how very lucid they were and how very clear they were. But what I want to find out is subsequently, I'm sure that when I go back and reflect and read some of the slides that were shared by the mentors and also the groups that presented, might come up with some questions. I want to know if it's possible for me to reach out to the mentors personally to ask them questions, or am I to drop those questions in the group? Like, do we have opportunities to reach out to them and ask them questions? Should we have in the future? That is my question. Thank you, sir.
Oh, all right. Marvelous. For your question, yes, I think it's possible to reach out with the mentors. You can connect with them on LinkedIn. I'm sure Mr. Ayobami and Mr. Yang are very active on those platforms, so you can connect with them on those platforms and send them a message. I don't know if Mr. Ayobami is willing, or Mr. Ayobami and Mr. Yang are willing to allow us also share their emails with the mentees in case if they want to reach out via mail. Just to confirm, sir, if that is something the mentors are open to.
No, I'm fine. I think.
Oh,
Yeah, it might even get me quicker on the email than on LinkedIn.
oh, all right. Thank you very much, sir. So what we will do is that we'll share our mentors' email with you, right, or with the group itself. So in case if you have questions you would like to ask them post class, right, you can always do that. And then as for the mentorship, we are done with the energy industry class, but we still have I think 2 weeks of other activities that are specifically scheduled for the mentees. So please, while we said you will not be having any more classes as tied to the energy industry, it doesn't overall mean that the program itself has ended, right? So just watch out. We will be sending notifications about the next line of actions, in the coming week. So just make sure to pay attention to your group. Thank you everyone for your presence in class. Thank you to our two mentors who shouldered the responsibility of taking us through today's topic. Just before we go for the mentees, one final time, we can just quickly take our pictures so that we can call it a day. Yeah, please let's turn on our videos, our cameras, so that we can take our last. All right, please can we have more people turn on their videos if that will be possible? For the mentees, please can we have you turn your videos on? Thank you, Chide Bube. Can we have more people turn on their videos? Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Ian. All right, so we are done with the pictures. Once again, thank you to everyone for making it to class today. For the mentors, a big thank you for everything that you have done for us. You've been with us through week one to this very point. So we really sincerely do appreciate you constantly showing up to make sure that, as it regards to the energy industry, our mentees are well educated and they have a sense of what is in the industry, right? So thank you very much. And for the mentees, please, like I earlier said, let's do well to watch out for the new information that will be shared in your group, so that you can follow accordingly with the tasks for next week and, even the forthcoming week. Once again, happy weekend, everyone, and please take care and good day.
And please, for the slides, I will just make that edit to the law that I cited and reshare so that you can share with them, please.
All right, sir, that's fine, sir. All right, thank you very much, sir.